Well, hello and welcome. I'm Zarrar Khuhro, and today we're going to be shining a spotlight on the pro-Palestinian protests sweeping the world and ask the one question that really matters. Can the protests affect any actual change, not just in public perception? One can argue that they already have, but more crucially in changing the policies of the Western capitals in which those protests are taking place. And so far, we've not really seen many signs of that. Joining us is journalist Vincent Bevins. He's the author of a book which just came out, in fact, in October this year. The mass protest decade and the if we burn the mass protest decade and the missing revolution. And in this, from what I understand of it, Mr. Bevins, you're saying that from 20 in the early 2000s, 2010 to 2020, we saw more people engaging in mass protests across the world than arguably at any time in history. Whether we take Hong Kong, we take the entirety of the Arab Spring, we take Turkey, even Iran to some extent, America, of course, BLM, so on and so forth. But we don't see the world we're living in be any more just or any more humane than it was. And in many cases, there's been a reversal if we look at the Arab world. If we were to take that and take that thesis, look at the pro-Palestinian protests, are they pointless in your opinion?
No, I don't think that they are pointless. One of the conclusions that I come to in this book, that yes, I think, as far as we know, is based on the data that there were more people protesting from 2010 to 2020 than at any other point. But now we're seeing another wave. And as I said at the end of the book, it was very possible we were going to see more waves, and now we're seeing them. It became clear in that research that protests are fundamentally communicative actions, right? You are sending a message to someone, and they also serve to build solidarity. People feel they can connect with other people that are part of a movement. Now, as communicative actions, I think that these protests have helped to make one message very clear, but I think that is a message that is clear to Israel, which is that much of the global community, quite a lot of the world, probably majority, certainly of the people on the UN Security Council that voted a few days ago, and probably majority of humanity are against the particular way that they're acting right now. So that message is sent. But Israel is a state that probably already knew that. Israel is a state that was constituted from the very beginning, often for understandable reasons, around the idea that much of the world is always going to be against whatever they do, that there is anti-Semitism in the world, that there is going to be a need for Israel because of this opposition. So they are not pointless, I think. But if you want to look at what will really change Israeli behavior, there are a set of more fine-tuned, a set of more specific inputs, especially in the US context, in my home country, that are emerging out of this broader milieu of protests. It's not exactly that the world shows Israel, or even Biden, that they're against it. It's not even exactly that the US populace might be able to show to Biden that they're against the support. There are very specific inputs that I think do matter, that are starting to bubble up in the United States, that are coming out of this this larger protest movement.
Such as?
Well, the United States government, Joe Biden, must respond in some very broad way, of course, to public opinion. But in the case of foreign policy, this is often something that US presidents ignore. But what we've seen in recent weeks are some interesting and unusual trends in domestic US politics. You're seeing dissent within the State Department. So you're seeing people that are members of the part of the US government that are tasked with overseeing US hegemony, either issuing a lot of dissent to Anthony Blinken, or there was one very high profile resignation. So when you see dissent within the state, this is something which is much harder to ignore than, Brazil and Colombia and Qatar saying that a genocide is being carried out. You're seeing polls that indicate that US voters, especially younger and non-white voters, are really turning against Israeli or pro-Israel policy in the Middle East. And then you're seeing the possibility that swing states, which matter quite a lot in the US electoral system, may come up for grabs in the upcoming election. So I would say that even if you could send a message that is loud and clear to Israel, which arguably has already been sent, that the world is against what they're doing, there's no automatic mechanism by which that stops Israel from doing what they're doing. But you do see other things that are happening at the same time, which are much harder to ignore for the most important ally of Israel, which is the United States.
Now, I mean, obviously, no one's expecting, Benjamin Netanyahu to take a look at a protest in New York and look at 500,000 people out on the streets and being like, okay, well, I'm just going to just stop the bombing right now, mea culpa, stand corrected. But we do see the beginnings of a critical mass developing, don't we? I mean, because you mentioned earlier, and I mean, the context of it was obviously different, that Israel perhaps already knew that the world would be against its actions. I'm going to just push back on that a little bit, because here in the global south, I can tell you that my jaw dropped to the floor, because we've been seeing, perhaps not, obviously not the way that they're depicted in Western media, but we've been seeing Israel carry out these kind of atrocities for decades, perhaps not at the scale and with the visibility and the sheer, the blatant nature of it, right? But we have been seeing them. I mean, this is something that we live with. Never in all my days could I have expected the kind of response that I have seen on the capitals of the Western world. So naturally, there is no automatic mechanism, as you say. Protest does not equal change in behavior of the person being protested against. But if we were to try and game this into the future, what does that mean for Israel's support in the West? Because the public is a crucial, ultimately the bank of that support.
Yeah, so I think that the U.S. especially and other the U.S. especially is a country which routinely violates the rules of the so-called international order. This is This is the nature of being the hegemon, especially in the ways that hegemony has been built since the end of World War II. But there are interesting moments, when this becomes especially visible and becomes a political issue. The last time in my lifetime that this became quite an obvious issue, propensity to violate the rules of the order which they so loudly defend was the 2003 invasion of Iraq, of course. But what's happening at the same time is not only an outpouring of opposition to U.S. policy, but a weakening of, in a very gradual, slow way. The United States is less powerful than it used to be. The United States is starting to, and I think this is what drives some of the State Department, because these officials are people that are committed to U.S. power. These are people that are committed to the project of what I would call U.S. empire, but they're starting to think, oh, this is not good even for our own self-interest. This is looking very, very bad. Across the global south, we are being called out very loudly for hypocrisy in ways that it's very difficult for us to come up with a coherent response. So I think there's a lot of elements that come together, and this protest wave helps to make these things clear, which lead to more concrete mechanisms and more concrete incentive shifts that the U.S. state especially has a very hard time ignoring.
Now, obviously, there's been a pushback from Israel and pro-Zionist circles. We'll come to that in a minute, but there's something, that sort of blows my mind, and I have not been able to wrap my head around it, right? I mean, all of this stuff that you just listed, right? I mean, Biden was already under siege from the Republicans, right? I mean, they're afraid of, yet another Trump, and oh my God, then there'll be fascism and so on and so forth. And at the same time, it is clear now, crystal clear, that he has alienated the vast bulk of the progressive Democrats. They weren't happy to begin with, especially young people, and now this seems to be a tipping point. The Arab American or the Muslim American vote, you can pretty much write off. You mentioned swing states, so Michigan, Dearborn, places like that. So here you see a president who admittedly is a self-proclaimed Zionist, there's plenty of speeches in that, willing to torch not only the Democratic Party's hold on power, apparently, but also his own personal political legacy and reputation in order to support the actions of a prime minister who would arguably be wiped out if there was an election in Israel today. Help me make sense of this, because I can't.
I think it is a strange conjunction. I think this also is what drives some of the State Department, because there is a feeling among some people in the U.S. government, even those that are most loudly committed to U.S. Power, that Israel might have been, Biden very famously said sometime in the 1970s, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. It's the best investment. It's the best investment money can buy. There is part of the U.S. state in the broadest sense that believes that, well, this served quite a lot of interest in the Cold War, helping to combat, Arab socialism emanating from Egypt, but now this is something which is not really helping. This is something which is, sort of this is running on its own, according to its own logic, without anyone stopping to think what if this actually serves U.S. interests. So now the cynical response would be that traditionally, and I hope this is not true, I build my entire work around trying to make this less true, but my entire career is around trying to make people care about what the U.S. does around the world. But the cynical response would be that traditionally the U.S. public has a short memory, and that foreign policy does not tend to decide elections. So there could be a more hard-headed element in the U.S. state that says, well, they'll forget about it. In 6 months there'll be something else, in 12 months there'll be something else, and what will really matter is the economy and Trumpism in 2024. But I agree with you. This is something that was predictable, another wave of protest in 2023, but it really, I think, took the world by surprise. And finding ways that it can translate to actual outcomes that truly benefit humanity, not just in Palestine, but everywhere, as we try to reformulate a global system which is less shaped by the violent violation of the rules that the U.S. so loudly defends, I think is something that this is a very critical moment for that kind of for that kind of analysis, and for trying to act upon this wave of energy in a way that can push it towards positive outcomes.
Now, there's been a lot of myths that have been shattered, at least as far as I'm concerned. I think as far as a lot of people are concerned. One, and this was a myth in the true sense, in the sense that it wasn't real, was that, the United States actually stands for human rights, justice, international law. No one in this part of the world has ever believed that, right? For living in living memory, right?
Right.
But the other one is the myth of Israeli invincibility. And I'm not talking in terms of from a military standpoint. We're not going to talk about that right now. But we were always brought up to think that Israeli propaganda, or pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist propaganda, is just so sophisticated. They're everywhere. How do you counter that narrative? And instead, you see the most ham-handed, ridiculous efforts coming out of that, from their end. And at the same time, you have their soldiers posting TikToks and being like, "Yes, we're committing genocide and proud of it." Happy Hanukkah. Weirdly enough, they even weaponizing the symbols of religion for that. Is that panic, do you think, or is it just that they've never really faced a challenge before of this nature?
It's hard to explain. I can't explain the phenomenon, but I could agree that I have seen these sort of strange slippages, this kind of disconnect between who they seem to be trying to be target, the people that are responsible. There are people whose job it is to of course defend Israeli policy, and the global audience that they often seem to be aiming for. There seems to be a kind of slippage where it's not working. You see that they try something else very quickly. There was this, even if you look at like the official Israel accounts, there was this one narrative that, well, we are a pro-LGBT force in the Middle East, and then like, oh wait, actually 2 weeks later we're going to post this video which is quite homophobic and transphobic, which is insulting U.S. college students that support Palestine. They're sort of like shooting in different directions. And again, I'm from the United States, and I find a very important set of responses is that among the U.S. Jewish community, right? So younger and more progressive Jewish Americans, it's been easy to see them either, Jewish Currents is a magazine which is doing very interesting things all the time. When you see the way that the largest Jewish community in the world outside of the United States, especially people my age or younger, are responding to Israeli messaging, especially under this Netanyahu government, because there's always this strange slippage as this like, well, you have to defend whatever Israel does if you defend the larger project. But of course, Netanyahu is just one of many possible leaders. He does not stand for the entire idea of Israel. So there does seem to be some short-circuiting happening between the messengers and the audience that they usually had reached quite easily, and now things seem to be being scrambled, perhaps just by the obvious horrors of what is happening in Gaza. It's very difficult to how do you spin global very, very credible global human rights organization saying journalists are being targeted intentionally. Look at all, there's this many children that have died in the last few months. So I can't explain the phenomenon, but I've also noticed it.
Yeah, now that's the thing when you talk about atrocity. Human rights organizations are one thing, but we're seeing genocide unfold on our Twitter timelines, right? In our TikTok messages, on Instagram. And I remember, we're all old enough to remember what happened in Bosnia. And we're all old enough to remember what happened in Rwanda. And there was always this persistent sort of narrative, or at least this thought there, that, hey, in this today's hyper-connected, hyper-aware, hyper-visual, live-streamed world, right? Something like the Bosnian genocide and the Rwandan genocide could not happen because we'd all be seeing it. But here we are all seeing it, and we see that the United States is the one country in the world to actively vote against stopping genocide. So there's this strange, dystopian, am I going insane feel to all of this. So that was all largely BS then, right? When people say that, oh, this can't happen in this day and age, because it's always been this day and it's always been this age, right?
Yeah, well, I actually quote in my book, If We Burn, I quote Gordon Brown, who says exactly this. I think it might have been 2009. He says, oh, in the age of Twitter, Facebook is not so really taken off. In the age of social media, Rwanda couldn't happen again. The world would see and the world would intervene. Well, everyone is seeing, right? And so I think across the 2010s, we saw there quite horrible things happen that social media certainly did not stop off, and they made them, they accelerated some of the negative tendencies in politics. But certainly right now, the responsibility to protect doctrine, for example, which was invoked to launch a regime change operation in Libya in 2011. Well, these are very, very clearly people that need protection, right? There are, I've seen because I worked as a correspondent in Southeast Asia for many years. So I've not only seen online, but I don't know a lot of Bosnians. I've seen Bosnians saying, oh, this is what they were saying about us. And then I've seen Vietnamese people who were living in Vietnam, people my age, but they say, oh, my parents or my grandparents who were living in the parts of Vietnam that were being bombed indiscriminately. They're saying, well, at least we had somewhere to hide. At least we could have run away. At least we had places that we had somewhere to go. They have nowhere to go. And yet this is all unfolding before everyone's waking up. And as you said, it's quite dystopian. And it is very maddening to wake up every day and you open your social media feeds and it's just horror after horror after horror.
It's like having a live stream into the Mongol invasion.
Into the Mongol invasions.
The Mongol invasions. It's like,
oh, okay, I see.
Malaku Khan burned down Baghdad while you have a drone videoing it all. Now that's the thing, right? Everybody in the world sees this, man. Vietnam, Rwanda, anywhere, especially the global south, that it resonates right. Deeply, and it's no longer, if it ever was a Muslim cause or an Arab cause, it's clearly far, far beyond that. And then at the same time, right, we've all monitored the way the Western media has covered this, and it's stunning to me to see that tens of thousands of deaths are just written off and justified, not just written off, justified. It's as if I'm seeing Radio Rwanda only in suits with stylists and blow-dried hair. And I think this is something I think I saw this on your Twitter timeline, that if they can write off these many deaths, what else can they write off? Right. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this was something that Colombian President Gustavo Petro said very recently at the COP summit. And he, again, you said this is no longer a Arab or a Muslim cause. Both Brazilian President Lula, who's probably who has one of the best and most wide-reaching positive reputations in the global south.
Absolutely.
And Gustavo Petro, both have said this is not a war anymore, this is a genocide. And what Petro said is, this is a window into what is going to happen with climate catastrophe. If the countries of the first world, especially the United States, if the rich countries are capable of supporting the mass slaughter of people in the global south for everyone to see, and just justifying and writing it off, blocking UN resolutions, imagine how easily they're going to play defense, ignore, explain mass deaths across the planet as a result of emissions, or hundreds of years of emissions, really, from the first world. And I think I found this quite striking and scary, because the world is entering history has always been full of problems and challenges, but the world is entering a planetary crisis, perhaps. And I think we're going to start seeing things that are easier to write off because they appear to be natural. Whereas this one is very clearly a US ally is doing it. They're targeting, everybody's saying, no, this person was targeted. This was a bomb dropped here. So if that can be explained away, it's very worrisome. What else can be explained away? What I also find very interesting when you talk about US media and suits and good haircuts is, as you said, many Israeli officials saying very clearly on the internet, well, this is what we're doing.
Yes,
this is what we're doing.
They're going to kill them all, men, women, children.
And then you have a class of media professionals in the United States whose job is to sort of reinterpret that to say, well, actually what they're doing is fighting terrorism. What they need to do is wipe out Hamas. Ignore all of those, as you said, the calls for ethnic cleansing or the calls to nuke Gaza. Ignore all that. That's, what they're really doing is this thing that sort of fits more easily into our narrative about what the kinds of things that we can support around the world. But at the same time, as you said, this is this weird short circuit. If you just turn to another part of your screen or you pull out your phone, it's like, oh, a major Israeli official is saying something very clearly for everyone to see, which is much, much more forceful and direct than what this task of sort of interpret is. It's like the oracle at Delphi, because the oracle at Delphi, you would go and then the actual woman would say nonsense, and then someone would have to interpret it, and that interpreter would able to come up with something that was rather reasonable or wise. But it's like if you go up and then there's no need for the interpretation because they're just telling you exactly this horrible message, and then say, well, I ignore that horrible message. I have a nicer one. It's very strange to watch, and I think again, polling in the US indicates that if you are young and if you are not white, you are really starting to turn on this uncritical support for Israel, which has been really fundamental to US foreign policy and certainly to Israeli policy in the region since the 1960s.
Yeah, and Netanyahu knows it, because that's why in a lot of leaked conversations he's expressed concern about those protests, because he knows where they can go. You use the term short circuit. I can assure you around here we're using far more uncharitable terms.
Okay.
for the Western media. We used to think that there was some kind of standard, but I can guarantee you that I don't think anyone over here is going to believe a word that comes out of there in the next 4 decades. Even if it's true, everything is going to be written off as propaganda from now on.
Well, this is a real problem with, even because the State Department, the White House, these are all very obvious actors, and I think that they act in an imperialist sense, and everybody knows that. But the active discrediting of the UN, the active discrediting of human rights organizations, the active discrediting of serious work that is done to tell the truth about massacres around the world, this is something which is very damaging, and I think is another unintended, perhaps intended consequence of this horrible conflict.
Last question, Vincent, and it's easy to ask, considerably tougher to answer. Where do we go from here? All the protests, all the direct actions. I know we can't predict the future, but if you could sketch out a few scenarios that you think may be more or less likely.
One lesson that did come out of this book that I just wrote is that you do not need to predict the future, but you do need to understand the more effective, the more you have a long-term strategic vision, the more effective that things will be. It's often, it can be very exciting to see a big upsurge of people, and it can be very, and that excitement can be important for long-term transformations, but often the transformations will be long-term. And so the idea, my personal instinct is to avoid jumping at the idea that this is all going to make a big change tomorrow. But as I said at the very beginning of the interview, look at ways in which this obvious surge of support for what I hope would be the human rights of everybody living in the region, Israelis, Palestinians, everybody that lives in the region, and find ways that can actually change the incentive structure faced by the most important actors, and then hopefully in a longer term, because the future lasts a long time, these problems aren't going away, change the ways in which, or reduce the ways in which, a small amount of often imperial actors that act in an imperial sense have far more say over global affairs than the vast majority of humanity. Because again, going into climate catastrophe, going into trying to solve the issue of which lives matter globally, if all of the decisions in the long term are made by a tiny group of people in the North Atlantic, then we're not going to have just outcomes. So I always push for serious analysis and long-term strategic thinking.
All right, so basically take that energy, take that passion, take that motivation and channel it.
Use it to build a strategic movement, yes.
Use it to build a strategic movement. That's interesting because I interviewed a Jewish peace activist, Raphael Shimunov, last month from If Not Now, and he said different words, but he said almost exactly the same thing. He was like, you need imperfect allies, you need critical mass, and you need radical solidarity. Thank you so much. That's Vincent Bevins, author of If We Burn, The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution. Thank you so much for your time.